The wind was a blade against Sarenvale's skin, sharp and merciless. Each gust stole what little warmth her threadbare cloak offered, leaving her bones aching with a familiar, deep-seated chill. It was a cold that had lived inside her for years, long before this bitter winter had descended upon the northern ridge. She pulled the hood lower, a futile gesture against the swirling snow that clung to her white lashes and melted on her pale cheeks. Her hair, the color of fresh snow itself, was indistinguishable from the blizzard around her, making her feel even more like the ghost everyone had always claimed she was. This journey was madness, she knew. Trespassing on the lands of the Blackwood Pack, the very pack that had cast her out, was a death sentence. But it was the anniversary, the day the world had cracked open and swallowed her whole, and she had a promise to keep. A silent vow made to the 2 stone markers that were all she had left of a life before the whispers, before the shame, her parents. The thought of them was a dull ache, a phantom limb that throbbed with memory. They had loved her unconditionally, had called her their little moonbeam, their winter miracle. They had never looked at her pale skin, her crimson-tinged eyes, and seen a curse. They had seen only their daughter, but their love had not been enough to shield her from the world, or from the rogue attack that had stolen them from her when she was just a child. After their deaths, she had been passed to her uncle, Lord Garin Thorne, and the warmth had bled out of her life entirely. He was her father's brother, but they shared no kinship of the heart. To him, she was a stain on his family's honor, a living symbol of misfortune. He had hidden her away, spoken to her in clipped, disgusted tones, and reminded her daily that her very existence was an embarrassment. The real breaking point, the moment the final shards of her spirit had shattered, had come on her 18th birthday, the day of her betrothal ceremony to Lord Darius Vexen. They had been promised to each other since birth, an alliance between 2 powerful families. She had held a sliver of hope, a foolish, girlish dream that perhaps he would see past the rumors, past the pallor of her skin. She had hoped he would see her. He had seen her all right. He had stood before the entire pack, his handsome face twisted into a sneer of contempt, and he had laughed. "This?" he had spat, gesturing to her as if she were a piece of spoiled meat. "You expect me to bind myself to this pale ghost? This omen of ill fortune? I reject her. I reject this curse." The words had echoed in the stunned silence, each one a hammer blow against her fragile heart. Rejected. Cursed. Ghost. The labels stuck, branding her more surely than any hot iron. After that, even her uncle's pretense of duty had vanished. She was driven from the packlands, an outcast with nothing but the clothes on her back and the hollowed-out cavern where her heart used to be. Now, 2 years later, she was returning to the one place that still felt like home, a small, forgotten burial ground on the very edge of the territory, nestled in a grove of ancient pines. Her parents were buried there, far from the main pack cemetery. Another subtle slight orchestrated by Lord Garin Thorne. It was a place of peace for her, the only place she didn't feel the weight of judging eyes. The wind howled, trying to turn her back, but she pushed onward, her thin legs trembling with exhaustion. The hunger gnawing at her belly was a constant companion, but the need to reach them, to whisper her sorrows to the cold stone, was stronger. It was a foolish pilgrimage, a risk that could cost her everything. But what did she really have left to lose? She was already a ghost, haunting the edges of a world that didn't want her. Finally, through the blinding white, she saw the dark shapes of the pines. Relief, cold and weak, washed through her. She stumbled into the relative quiet of the grove, the snow shallower here, sheltered by the heavy boughs. Her eyes sought out the familiar shapes of the 2 headstones, side by side. But something was wrong. A third shape lay sprawled across the snow before them, a massive, dark stain against the pristine white. Her breath caught in her throat. Fear, sharp and primal, shot through her. A rogue? A predator drawn by the scent of death? She flattened herself behind a thick trunk, peering into the gloom. It wasn't moving. As her eyes adjusted, she realized it was a wolf larger than any she had ever seen, its fur not dark, but a brilliant, shocking silver white, almost glowing in the dim light. It was the color of moonlight on a frozen lake. Its magnificent coat was matted with blood. Dark, ugly gashes marred its flank, oozing a blackish substance that sizzled faintly against the snow. Its breathing was shallow, each exhale a painful-looking cloud in the frigid air. It was dying. Every instinct screamed at her to run. This was Blackwood territory. This was a predator. She was an omega, the weakest of the weak. She was prey. She should save herself. What little of herself was left. But as she watched the great beast's chest stutter with a pained gasp, something else stirred within her. Compassion. It was a foolish, dangerous emotion that had brought her nothing but pain, yet it refused to die. She looked at the magnificent creature, brought low and suffering, and she saw a reflection of her own lonely agony. Here was another being, alone and dying in the cold. She couldn't leave it. She just couldn't. Taking a hesitant step forward, she moved from the safety of the trees. The wolf didn't stir. Its eyes were closed, its massive head resting on the snow as if it had finally surrendered. "Hello?" she whispered, her voice immediately snatched away by the wind. She knelt beside it, her own cold forgotten in the face of its immense suffering. The wounds were deep, and the black ooze spoke of poison. Wolfsbane, and a potent strain at that. She had no idea how to cure it, but she couldn't just watch it die. Without a second thought, she unwrapped the thickest part of her cloak, the one piece of quality wool her mother had woven for her, and began tearing it into strips. Her hands, numb with cold, fumbled with the fabric. "I don't know if this will help," she murmured to the unconscious wolf, her voice soft and shaky. "But it's all I have." She gently cleaned the edges of the wounds with snow, her touch as light as a falling feather. The wolf flinched in its sleep, a low growl rumbling in its chest, but it did not wake. She took the strips of her cloak and began to bind the wounds, tightly enough to staunch the bleeding, but not so tight as to cause more pain. As she worked, the loneliness that was her constant shadow pressed in, and she found herself talking, the words spilling out in a quiet, desperate stream. "You're so beautiful," she whispered, her fingers brushing against the surprisingly soft, silver-white fur. "They call me a ghost because of my hair. The color of bad luck, they say. But yours is like the moon." She confessed everything to the dying wolf, the silent clearing her confessional. She told him about her parents, about the warmth of their love and the cold emptiness of their absence. She spoke of Lord Garanthorn and his cruel words, of the endless nights she had spent crying herself to sleep in the cold attic he'd called her room, and she told him about Lord Darius Vexen. The shame of that day was still a fresh, gaping wound. "He looked at me like I was vermin," she choked out, a tear freezing on her cheek. "He said I was a curse. Maybe he was right. Everything I touch seems to wither." She finished wrapping the last wound and sat back on her heels, exhausted. The wolf's breathing seemed a little steadier, a little deeper. Or perhaps that was just her hopeful imagination. The blizzard raged on, and the temperature continued to plummet. She knew she wouldn't survive the night out here alone. Her own strength was nearly gone. She looked at the massive, warm body of the wolf. It was a risk, a terrible risk. But it was also her only chance. Hesitantly, she lay down in the snow, curling her small, shivering frame against the wolf's broad back, tucking herself between its powerful legs. The heat radiating from its body was a shock, a profound comfort that seeped through her thin clothes and into her frozen limbs. It was more warmth than she had felt in years. She buried her face in its thick fur, inhaling the scent of pine, winter, and a raw, untamed power that should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like a strange sort of sanctuary. "At least," she whispered into the fur, her eyelids growing heavy, "we won't die alone." With that final, desolate thought, Saren Vale surrendered to the encroaching darkness, her small, pale form nestled against the silver giant, two outcasts weathering in the storm together. Saren Vale awoke to a world of jarring silence. The wind had died, and the dawn light filtering through the pines was a soft, pearly gray. For a moment, she was disoriented, her body stiff and cold but alive. The heat source she'd clung to all night was still there, a steady, living furnace against her back. Then she heard it, the crunch of heavy paws on snow, a sound that sent a spike of pure adrenaline through her veins. She scrambled up, her heart hammering against her ribs. They were surrounded. At least a dozen wolves, enormous and dark-furred, stood in a loose circle around the clearing. They were not rogues. They were warriors, disciplined and alert, their pelts marked with an insignia she didn't recognize, A silver wolf's head howling at a full moon. Fear, cold and sharp, seized her. They had found her. Trespassing. The penalty was death. She looked at the silver wolf, still lying motionless on the ground. Were they here for him? To finish the job the poison had started? A man stepped forward from the ranks of wolves. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face a roadmap of old scars, and one eye was a milky white. He radiated authority. This was their alpha. His gaze swept over the scene, taking in the wounded silver wolf, and then landing on her. His one good eye narrowed with a terrifying intensity. Sarenvale's blood ran cold. This was it. This was the end. But a strange, protective instinct, born in the shared vulnerability of the night, surged through her. She did the most foolish thing she had ever done in her life. She moved to stand between the scarred alpha and the silver wolf, spreading her arms as if her frail body could possibly shield the colossal creature behind her. "Don't hurt him," she pleaded, her voice barely a whisper. "He's already dying." The scarred alpha, a warrior she would later come to know as Commander Rogar Fenwin, stared at her, his expression unreadable. He didn't seem angry, but rather confused. He took another step forward, and she flinched, bracing for the blow. But he ignored her completely. His eyes, and the eyes of every warrior present, were fixed on the silver wolf. To her utter astonishment, Commander Rogar Fenwin dropped to one knee in the snow. One by one, the other warriors followed suit, bowing their heads in a gesture of profound reverence. What was happening? Who was this wolf that commanded such loyalty from these fearsome soldiers? The air in the clearing began to crackle with an unseen energy. It shimmered around the silver wolf, a visible distortion like heat haze rising from summer asphalt. A low groan came from the wolf, a sound of immense effort and pain. Sarenvale watched, frozen in place, as its form began to shift. Bones cracked and reformed, limbs elongated, and the silver fur receded, melting away to reveal pale skin. It was a transformation, but unlike the swift, almost seamless change she was used to seeing. This was agonizing, forced. Where the magnificent beast had lain, a man now knelt on all fours, his head bowed, his body trembling. He pushed himself up slowly, unsteadily, to his full height, and Sarenvale forgot how to breathe. He was the tallest man she had ever seen, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the world. His body was a tapestry of lean, powerful muscle, crisscrossed with scars both old and new. But it was his hair and eyes that held her captive. His hair was the same color as his wolf's fur, a stunning, ethereal silver white that fell to his shoulders. And when he finally lifted his head, his eyes met hers. They were not red-tinged like her own, but the color of pure, molten silver, glowing with an inner light and an ancient power that struck her to the very core of her being. This was no ordinary alpha. This was something more. This was royalty. Commander Rogar Fenwin, the scarred warrior, rose to his feet. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice thick with relief and concern. "King, Kaelin Draven. We feared the worst. The assassin's trail went cold in the blizzard. King, the Alpha King, the supreme ruler of all the packs in the Northern Territories, a figure of legend she had only heard about in hushed, awestruck whispers. He was supposed to be 1,000 miles away in his mountain fortress. What was he doing here, wounded and alone?" King Kaelin Draven swayed, and Commander Rogar Fenwin moved to support him, but the king waved him off. His silver eyes never left Sarenvale. "I was ambushed," Calthorn said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated through the snow-covered ground. "A dozen of them, hired blades, using an assassin's blend of wolfsbane. I dealt with them, but the poison, it took hold faster than I anticipated." He took a deep, shuddering breath, his hand going to the crude bandages on his side. He looked down at the torn strips of her mother's cloak, then back up at her. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his silver eyes. He addressed Commander Rogar Fenwin, but his gaze remained locked on Sarenvale. "I would have died. The cold and the poison would have finished me by sunrise." He raised a hand and pointed a single, steady finger at her. "This Omega, she saved my life." The collective gaze of the royal guard shifted to her. The suspicion in their eyes was replaced by a wave of shock, confusion, and a dawning, grudging respect. Sarenvale felt her face flush. She wanted the ground to open up and swallow her. She had touched a king. She had spoken to him as if he were a common stray. She had huddled against his body for warmth. The enormity of her actions crashed down on her, and she began to tremble. This time not from cold, but from pure, unadulterated terror. What had she done? King Kalen Draven took a step toward her, his movements still stiff with pain. He was a mountain of a man, and she felt like a fragile sapling in his shadow. She wanted to shrink away, to become invisible, but his silver gaze held her fast. As he drew closer, the air between them thickened, charged with that same strange energy from his transformation. A spark, bright and hot, leaped between them. It was not a physical spark, but she felt it all the same, a jolt that ran up her spine and made every nerve in her body sing. It was a feeling of sudden, shocking connection, of a lock finding its key. Calethorn stopped dead, his powerful body going rigid. His silver eyes widened, the pupils dilating until they were almost black. The look on his face was one of utter, profound astonishment. He stared at her, not as a king looks at a subject, or as a man looks at a stranger, but as if he were seeing the sunrise for the very first time. He breathed a single word, a word that shattered the quiet of the morning and the foundations of Sarenvale's world. Mate. The word was not a question. It was a statement of absolute, unshakable fact. It hung in the frozen air, imbued with centuries of meaning, destiny, and power. Sarenvale's mind went blank. It was as if her brain had simply ceased to function. Mate. The Alpha King's mate. It was impossible. It was a cruel joke. The Solara, the Moonweaver, the Weaver of Destinies, could not be so capricious, so insane. She was Sarenvale, the outcast, the rejected, the pale ghost. She was broken, worthless, and utterly alone. Her voice, when she found it, was a pathetic squeak. No, she whispered, shaking her head frantically. She took a step back, stumbling over her own feet. No, you're mistaken. The poison must be making you see things. I'm nobody. The king's expression softened, the shock giving way to a look of such intense, bone-deep certainty that it terrified her more than any anger could have. The goddess does not make mistakes, he said, his voice gentle but firm, leaving no room for argument. He took another step, closing the distance between them. He was so close now she could feel the heat rolling off his body, could see the flecks of a darker gray in his silver irises. I have waited 300 years for this moment. I would know my own soul when I see it. But you don't see me, she cried, the words tearing from her throat, raw with years of pain. You see what you want to see. I am flawed. I am a curse. My own pack threw me away. My own betrothed rejected me in front of everyone. I am not fit to be the mate of a common warrior, let alone a king. The desperate, ugly truth of her life spilled out, and she hated the sound of her own pathetic pleading. She was trying to warn him, to push him away before he could see the truth for himself, and cast her aside just like Valerius had. The second rejection would surely kill her. Calethorn listened to her frantic denials, his expression unchanging. When she finally fell silent, gasping for breath, he reached out, his large hand moving slowly, giving her time to pull away. She stood frozen as his fingers gently brushed a strand of white hair from her face. His touch was like a brand, sending a shiver of warmth through her. Flawed? He repeated softly, his thumb stroking her cheekbone. I see strength that has endured unimaginable cruelty. Cursed? I see a mark of the ancient lunar bloodline, a lineage so old and powerful that lesser wolves have forgotten its meaning and now fear it as an ill omen. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to an intimate whisper. My own lineage. They call you a ghost? Then we shall be ghosts together. He straightened up, his silver eyes blazing with a conviction that stole the air from her lungs. You say you were rejected. The fool who cast you aside did not reject you. He rejected a gift from the goddess herself. He threw away the moon because he was too blind to see its light. He turned his head, his commanding gaze sweeping over his stunned warriors. His voice rose, no longer soft and intimate, but filled with the booming authority of a king making a royal decree. Hear me. This is Sarenvale, my fated mate. From this day forward, she is your queen. The proclamation echoed through the silent grove. The royal guards, to a man, dropped to one knee again, but this time, their heads were bowed to her, to Sarenvale, the nobody, the outcast. You will show her every honor, every respect, Kelthorn commanded. Her word is my word. Her safety is your sacred duty. Anyone who harms her, anyone who insults her, will answer to me. He turned back to her, the hardness in his face melting away once more. He saw the terror in her eyes, the utter disbelief warring with a tiny, fragile flicker of hope. You are safe now, he said, his voice gentle again. I swear on my life and my crown, no one will ever hurt you again. But his words of safety felt like the bars of a gilded cage slamming shut around her. Queen, mate, it was too much. The world tilted on its axis, the edges of her vision going dark. The cold, the hunger, the shock it all crashed down on her at once. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed, pitching forward into the darkness. The last thing she remembered being the feel of strong, steady arms catching her before she hit the ground. Sarenvale drifted back to consciousness slowly, as if surfacing from a deep, dark ocean. The first thing she registered was warmth. A profound, all-encompassing warmth that seemed to soak into her very bones, chasing away the permanent chill that had been her companion for years. She was lying on something impossibly soft, nestled under layers of what felt like velvet and fur. The air smelled of beeswax, old parchment, and dried lavender. It was a scent of comfort and peace. She cracked her eyelids open, wincing at the soft light of a roaring fireplace that cast dancing shadows across a high, vaulted ceiling. She was in a bed larger than the entire hovel she had been calling home. Carved wooden posts reached toward the ceiling, draped in heavy, forest-green curtains. This was not a healer's tent or a guard's barracks. This was a room fit for royalty. Panic flared in her chest, and she sat up abruptly. The room spun for a moment, and a wave of dizziness washed over her. A gentle hand pressed against her shoulder, easing her back down against the pillows. "Easy, my lady," a soft, feminine voice said. "You have been through a great ordeal." Sarenvale turned her head to see a kind-faced, middle-aged woman sitting in a chair beside the bed. The woman had warm brown eyes and streaks of gray in her braided hair. She wore the simple but well-made dress of a high-ranking servant. "My name is Miran Holt," the woman said with a small smile. "I am the head cook, but the king has asked me to look after you." The king. The words brought the memories of the snow-covered clearing rushing back. The silver wolf. The transformation. Mate. Queen. It hadn't been a dream. "Where am I?" Sarenvale whispered, her throat dry. "You are in the king's palace, in the Sunstone Citadel," Miran Holt replied, offering her a goblet of water. Sarenvale drank greedily, the cool liquid a balm to her parched throat. "His Majesty brought you here himself." Miran Holt's eyes held a mixture of awe and curiosity as she looked at Sarenvale. The news of the king's fated mate, a pale, unknown Omega found half-frozen in the woods, had surely spread through the palace like wildfire. Sarenvale shrank back against the pillows, feeling the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes on her. She felt like an imposter, a stray dog brought into a temple. The fine linen sheets felt alien against her skin, the opulent room a mockery of her entire existence. Over the next few days, Sarenvale lived in a state of suspended disbelief. She was treated with a deference that was both unnerving and deeply uncomfortable. Servants bowed to her. Guards nodded respectfully as she passed. Miran Holt brought her trays of delicious, nourishing food that made her want to weep after years of scavenging for scraps. She was given beautiful clothes, soft wool dresses, warm fur-lined cloaks that felt like costumes on her thin frame. She saw her reflection in a silver mirror and barely recognized the girl staring back. Her face had more color, her eyes were clearer, but she still felt like the same broken, worthless Omega on the inside. King Kaelin Draven was the soul of patience. He seemed to understand her fear and fragility. He did not press her, did not demand she accept her new role or the bond that hummed between them like a living current. Instead, he gave her space, but he was always a steady, reassuring presence. He would invite her to walk with him in the vast, snow-dusted palace gardens. During these walks, he spoke not of their bond or of her duties as queen, but of simple things. He pointed out the different species of winter-blooming roses his mother had cultivated centuries ago. He told her about the ancient history of the Citadel, its stones laid by the Lokins, first wolves to settle these mountains. He talked about his own life, of the loneliness of his long reign. He confessed that he had begun to believe the Solara, the Moonweaver, had forgotten him, that he was destined to rule alone forever, and he talked about their shared trait, the silver-white hair and pale skin. In the old tongue, he explained one afternoon as they stood before a frozen waterfall. Our kind were called the Luanir the moon touched. It was believed we were born with a fragment of the moon's spirit in our souls. It was a sign of great wisdom and compassion. It was only in the last few centuries that fear and superstition twisted it into a curse. He reached out and gently touched a lock of her white hair. It is not a curse, Sarenvale. It is a crown. His words were a balm on a wound she hadn't even realized was still festering. For the first time, she looked at her own reflection and didn't see a flaw, but a flicker of the magic he spoke of. Yet the fear remained, a stubborn, deep-rooted weed. His kindness felt conditional, his patience finite. The ghost of Valerius's sneering face was always at the edge of her thoughts. How long before Calethorn realized his mistake? How long before he saw the scared, broken Omega beneath the fine clothes and decided she wasn't worthy? The mate bond pulled at her, a constant, gentle pressure on her heart, urging her to trust, to accept, to lean into the safety he offered. But her fear was a shield, forged in years of pain and rejection. She couldn't bring herself to lower it. She was terrified that the moment she did, he would strike, and the blow would be the one from which she would never recover. So she remained hesitant, quiet, and distant, trapped in a gilded cage of her own making, unable to believe that she was truly, finally, home. The delegation arrived on a crisp, clear morning a week after her arrival. Sarenvale was in the great library, a cavernous room filled with the scent of old books and crackling firewood, when she heard the commotion in the main hall. Calethorn had encouraged her to explore the palace, to treat it as her own home, though the concept was still alien to her. Curiosity piqued. She peeked out from behind a towering shelf of scrolls. A group of wolves from a visiting pack were being announced by the royal herald, Thalen Crown. They were here to pay their annual tribute and deliver reports. Her blood turned to ice in her veins when she saw their banner, the snarling black wolf on a field of gray. It was the sigil of the Blackwood Pack. Her heart began to pound a frantic, terrified rhythm against her ribs. She saw him immediately. Her uncle, Lord Garin Thorne, stood at the head of the delegation, his face set in its usual stern, disapproving lines. And beside him, looking arrogant and self-important in his formal attire, was Lord Darius Vexen. The sight of them stole the air from her lungs. This was her worst nightmare realized. They were here, in her sanctuary. She instinctively recoiled, melting back into the shadows of the library, her mind racing. She had to hide. If they saw her, what would they do? What would they say? They would expose her. They would tell the king what she truly was, a rejected, worthless Omega. And then he would see. He would see the truth and cast her out, just as they had. She tried to slip away, to find a back corridor that would lead her back to the safety of her chambers. But it was too late. Calethorn strode into the hall from the throne room, his presence immediately commanding the attention of everyone present. He nodded a formal greeting to the delegation, his silver eyes cool and assessing. And then he glanced toward the library, his gaze finding her instantly, as it always did. A small, encouraging smile touched his lips. He thought she had come to greet the visitors. Before she could signal her distress, Lord Garin Thorne and Lord Darius Vexen followed his gaze. Their eyes landed on her. For a moment, there was only confusion on their faces. They saw a woman in a fine velvet gown, her white hair elegantly braided with silver thread, standing in the king's library. Then, recognition dawned. Valerius's eyes widened, and a slow, cruel smirk spread across his handsome face. He saw not a future queen, but the same pathetic Omega he had thrown away, somehow dressed in borrowed finery. Lord Garin Thorne's expression soured, his lips thinning in disgust. Well, Valerius said, his voice loud enough to carry across the polished marble floor. Look what the palace cat dragged in, the pale ghost. He took a swaggering step forward, his eyes roaming over her with a possessive insolence that made her skin crawl. I must say, Sarenvale, you clean up surprisingly well. What are you doing here, little curse? Did you sneak in to steal from the kitchens? His words were laced with the same casual cruelty she remembered so well, designed to humiliate and diminish her. She felt herself shrink, the familiar shame washing over her in a suffocating wave. She wanted to be invisible. She wanted to die. Lord Thorn stepped forward, his voice dripping with false piety as he addressed Thorn, though his eyes were fixed on Vale with cold fury. Your Majesty, I must apologize for this creature. She is a disgrace from our pack, an outcast we banished for her own good. She has a habit of wandering where she does not belong. Valerius took another step, his smirk widening as he reached for her arm. She is still Blackwood property, technically. He sneered. Whatever trouble she has caused, we will deal with her. You will come with us now, Omega. He saw her as nothing more than a stray to be collared and dragged away. His fingers were about to close around her wrist when a blur of motion intervened. Thorn moved with a speed that was terrifying. One moment he was by the throne, the next he was standing in front of Vale, his body, a solid, immovable shield. He caught Valerius's wrist in a grip of iron. The crack of bone was sickeningly loud in the suddenly silent hall. Valerius screamed, a high-pitched sound of shock and agony. You will release my mate, Thorn said. His voice was not loud. It was a low, deadly growl, colder than any winter wind, and it promised death. He squeezed, and Valerius fell to his knees, his face white with pain. At that moment, Thorn unleashed his alpha aura. It was not the casual pressure of a dominant wolf. It was the full, unrestrained power of an ancient king. It crashed down upon the hall like a physical weight, a force of nature that buckled the knees of every member of the Blackwood delegation. Lord Thorn collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, his face a mask of terror as he finally understood the gravity of his mistake. Thorn's silver eyes, blazing with a fury that was truly terrifying, were locked on Valerius. You dare! He hissed the words, vibrating with power. To lay your filthy hands on your queen? He shoved Valerius away, sending him sprawling on the floor. You speak of curses? The only curse here is your own monumental stupidity. The Solara, the Moonweaver, gifted you with a treasure beyond measure, and you were too arrogant and too blind to see it. You cast away the moon and settled for dust. He turned his wrathful gaze on Lord Thorn, who was trembling on the marble. And you, who were sworn to protect her, you tormented her. You called her a disgrace. You are the disgrace. You are a stain on the honor of the Alpha title. He drew himself up to his full, imposing height, the very air seeming to bend to his will. This is my decree, he boomed, his voice echoing off the stone walls. The Blackwood pack is on notice. You will return to your lands and remove these two from all positions of power. They will live out their days as the lowest of Omegas, stripped of all rank and privilege. If I ever hear that Vale's name has been spoken with anything but the utmost reverence in your territory, I will not send a warning. I will send an army, and I will wipe your pathetic pack from the face of this earth. He looked down at the groveling, humiliated wolves. Now get out of my sight. Scrambling like beaten dogs, Marius and Valerius, clutching his broken wrist, crawled and stumbled their way out of the great hall, their delegation scurrying after them. The hall was silent once more, the oppressive weight of the king's aura slowly receding. And in that silence, a single sound could be heard, a soft sob. Vale stood where Thorn had shielded her, tears streaming down her face. But they were not tears of fear or shame. They were tears of profound, earth-shattering relief. The walls she had built around her heart, the shield of fear she had carried for so long, had not just cracked. They had been utterly obliterated by the force of his fury, by the ferocity of his defense. He had not believed them. He had not cast her out. He had stood before her tormentors and called her a treasure. He had called her his queen. He had defended her. For the first time in her entire life, someone had fought for her. The last of her doubts, the last of her fears, washed away in the flood of her tears, leaving behind only the pure, brilliant warmth of the bond that connected her to the magnificent king who stood before her. As the last of the Blackwood delegation scrambled from the hall, Thorn's rigid posture softened. The terrifying king vanished, and in his place was the man who had spoken to her of winter roses. He turned to her, his silver eyes filled with a fierce, protective tenderness. He saw her tears, and a flicker of concern crossed his face. He reached for her, his movements gentle, and pulled her into his arms. This time she did not flinch. She did not pull away. She collapsed against him, burying her face in the hard warmth of his chest, her hands clutching his tunic as if he were the only solid thing in a spinning world. He held her, one hand stroking her hair, the other resting securely on the small of her back, simply letting her cry. He was her anchor in the storm, her shield, her sanctuary. "I was so scared," she finally whispered against his chest, her voice muffled by the fabric. Her tears began to subside, replaced by a sense of calm she had never known. "I know," he murmured into her hair, his deep voice a comforting vibration against her ear. "I am sorry you had to see them again. I should have foreseen it." She pulled back just enough to look up at him, her tear-stained face open and vulnerable. The fear was gone from her eyes, replaced by a dawning wonder and a certainty that felt as deep and true as the earth beneath her feet. "You called me a treasure," she said, her voice filled with awe. He smiled, a genuine, breathtaking smile that lit up his stern features. "Because you are. You are the most precious treasure in all my lands, Saren Vale." Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she met his gaze, her own crimson-tinged eyes clear and resolute. The hesitation was gone. The internal conflict was over. All that was left was the undeniable truth of the bond that pulsed between them, a living, breathing entity of light and warmth. "I accept," she said, her voice quiet but strong, ringing with a newfound confidence. "I accept the bond, Calethorn." She saw the immense tension he had been carrying in his powerful shoulders finally dissolve. A wave of profound relief washed over his face, so potent it was almost tangible. "I choose you," she added, the words feeling more right than anything she had ever said. She needed him to know this wasn't just fate or destiny for her. It was a choice, her choice. His silver eyes shone with a joy so intense it stole her breath. "And I," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "will spend every day of my long life proving you made the right choice." He gently cupped, her face in his large, warm hands, his thumbs stroking the tears from her cheeks. He looked at her as if she were the most beautiful, miraculous thing he had ever seen. He lowered his head, his gaze never leaving hers, giving her every chance to turn away. She did not. She leaned into his touch, rising on her toes to meet him. Their lips met, and the world fell away. It was not a kiss of frantic passion, but of deep, resonant homecoming. It was the feeling of a fractured soul being made whole, of a wanderer finally finding their way. A brilliant, golden light exploded behind her eyes, the mate bond sealing itself between them, a permanent, unbreakable connection. It was fire and lightning, peace and sanctuary, all at once. In his kiss, she was no longer the outcast, the ghost, the curse. She was loved, she was cherished, she was queen. The weeks that followed were a blur of joy and discovery. The official mating ceremony was a grand affair, celebrated throughout the kingdom. Wolves from every allied pack came to pay their respects, their eyes filled not with pity or scorn, but with genuine reverence for the king's chosen. Saren Vale stood beside Calethorn on the great balcony of the citadel, no longer hiding in the shadows but bathed in the warm light of the Sunday. Dressed in gowns of silver and white that no longer felt like a costume but like her own skin, she was not the pale ghost of her past. She was the Silver Queen, her once cursed features now hailed as a sign of divine favor, a living embodiment of the moon's grace. With Calethorn's unwavering support, she found her voice. The timid Omega who once flinched at her own shadow began to speak with a quiet authority that captivated all who heard her. She discovered that the years of suffering had not broken her, they had forged her. Her compassion, born from a deep understanding of pain, became her greatest strength as a ruler. Her first official decree, issued with Calethorn's proud blessing, was the establishment of a network of sanctuaries for Omegas and other outcasts who had been abused or abandoned by their packs. She used her new power not for revenge, but for protection, ensuring that no one else would ever have to suffer the loneliness and despair that she had endured. She would visit these sanctuaries, sitting not on a throne but on a simple stool, listening to the stories of the broken and offering them the same kindness that had once saved a dying king in a snowstorm. She learned that true strength was not about dominance or power, but about the courage to be kind in a cruel world. Her life had been a long, cold winter, but now spring had finally come. She had Calethorn, her mate, her king, her partner in all things. His love was a constant, steady flame that had thawed the ice around her heart and allowed her to bloom. She had found her purpose, not just as a queen, but as a beacon of hope for the lost and the forgotten. Standing beside him, looking out over the vast, peaceful kingdom they would rule together, she finally understood. Her rejection had not been the end of her story. It had been a painful, necessary detour that had led her down a winding path, through a dark forest, to her true destiny. It had led her home,